Chris Brown, Steve Tasker with you, and without any further ado, we go to the phone lines, and bringing us in on a Zoom call here anyway is NFL Executive Vice President of Football Operations, Troy Vincent, joining us here. And Troy, good to see your face, good to talk to you, and I guess we should start with the news that the league released today. NFL Draft is going to take place in Cleveland. It looks like it's the virtual days of the draft, at least, are partially over.
Well, let me begin by just saying, you two are some of my favorite people, two of my favorite people.
Oh, wow, look at that. He's laying it on thick early here, Steve.
No, I just want to say, Chris, you were an intricate part of kind of who I was and what I did in the community when I was a Bill. And just, Steve, just the respect that I have for you as a player, as a legend, in Miami, watching you dominate us for many years. Thanks for having me again. The draft, yes, it's here. And there were some things that we learned last year from a virtual standpoint that we'll incorporate this year. But the plans are to have a live event. I began reaching out to prospects to see if it's something that they wouldn't mind joining us and us celebrating their collegiate careers. And as we look towards the future stars. So we're looking forward to going to Cleveland.
One thing is, since you're laying it on thick for us, let me just say this. I got to congratulate. I don't know how much you've heard of this. I think it was one of the great accomplishments in American sports for you guys to get 256 regular season games in during the global pandemic and the playoffs and the Super Bowl. Certainly there were some snafus and some hiccups along the way, but to get all 256 games in, what was the attitude in the office there at Park Avenue in the office when you guys got all those games in? You had to take a great deal of pride in that.
Yes, and I would say it began with teamwork. When people talk about like the values of our game and what the values, what does the game do? I saw teamwork, Steve, at its best. I saw people working together for a common interest. That's the player, that's the coach, that's the principal owner, that's the Players Association. We were just aiming towards, hey, we got to be flexible. Don't ever take it personal. It's not going to be equal. We talk about equity all the time. And we have to follow the science. And that's really like, okay, what's the barometer? We begin every discussion. What's the medical community saying? How can we apply that to our daily business? And I would just say the teamwork. And Dr. Seals, Jeff Miller, Dawn Aponte, who works directly with myself, and Larry Verrazani, I've shared this with the commissioner and others all the time. It does not happen. They were the glue to getting 256 games in 17 weeks. Every week we had to adjust, and we did it. I compliment the players, the coaches. Everyone had to remain flexible. I got worried maybe once or twice that we were running out of options as we saw the infection take place in different cities. Okay, as we started marching towards week 13, we start losing some of our options and flexibility on schedule, but we did it. Got to the playoffs and had a fabulous Super Bowl.
How was it, Troy? Maybe just take us behind the scenes a little bit in some of those moments that raised the level of stress in dealing with pivoting from and reacting to some of the things that the virus was doing in various NFL cities. Like, did you guys just have Dr. Sills on speed dial? This guy, like,
he lived with all of us. He lived with all of us. He was on speed dial, Zoom dial, you call it. And Chris, I would say this. We started off one way. And as the season progressed, week 3 or 4, the contact tracing, we didn't have that figured out early on. But I believe once we realized how the contact tracing worked inside of the system, the process, once we were able to identify, isolate, and contain possible spread, then we were able to move forward with scheduling a game. Once we got those 3 areas down, we knew it. That process took about 6 weeks into the regular season. But once we got it, again, identify the problem, isolate the problem, then contain it. Now we were able to schedule games.
And now with the season that has happened, you got moved into the off season. Free agency has gone off without a hitch so far. Now you're looking at the draft. How is the 17th game? What kind of curveball has that made, if any, for the scheduling, for facility availability, stadiums, the equity of an odd number of games. How is that? How's that formulated?
Oh, no eyeball,
working?
Steve. I look at it as just from my view now, and I'm thinking back as a former player, that actually presents some opportunities here. One, some flexibility, maybe on the international front. But I like the idea of being able to create some competitiveness inside the conference, being able to schedule some games the schedule doesn't allow us to do in 16 games. But there's some matchups I think that we all would like to see in conference that I believe the 17 game, that flexibility, it allows us to do so. Again, the odd number, we'll just deal with that. I do believe eventually we'll get to potentially even making that even. But I believe both the players, obviously the fans, this is a win-win for all. Club ownership, players, fans. I think it'd be good for the game. I really do.
And then just with respect, Troy, and you may not be able to answer this because there's not enough information for the league to make a decision yet, but just with respect to OTAs and mini camps, which we all know were fully virtual last year, it still doesn't look like it's come into complete focus in terms of what you'll be able to and not to do because we're dealing with a national vaccination rollout. We know that 20 and 30-somethings are not going to be high on the vaccination list, so we may very well get to April and May and even June, and there might still be an awful lot of players out there who have not been vaccinated. Are there certain things, bars you guys are trying to clear before you can say, you know what, we can have an in-person OTA schedule or an in-person June minicamp schedule?
Well, that conversation is a daily conversation. I had an opportunity to participate at least last week's call with Chairman Mara, Commissioner Goodell, and D and JC Treader to talk about, okay, what does phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 look like? Always following the science. I think Dr. Seals has taught us all that we're still in a pandemic. And there were things that worked last offseason from a virtual standpoint. So what's the integration? Being reasonable and responsible. We saw it work last year. There were elements that work. We're in a different place now. Vaccinations are now increasing. We're seeing hospitalization rates are now decreasing. What can we do to be responsible, both for the organization, the players, the staffs that are there, coming back in, the rookies, the veterans? So that's a daily conversation. I think it'll be resolved here fairly quickly. But when I say both sides, meaning Chairman Mara, D, Commissioner Larry Verasani, the teams are working. Hey, let's try to be reasonable and responsible, getting the guys back at work. We do know one thing: the club facilities are the safest places for the men to work out. Many are coming in now to rehab. The clubs, the coaches, the players, they don't want to be off-site working out. Let's get them into a secure facility, which we've seen works over the last year, and see if we can put some things together to get the guys back into the facility to get prepared for this next run.
I know with everything else on your plate with the COVID and trying to get guys, like you say, all these things, these extra layers of difficulty that you guys have to navigate through. What about the old things that we always worry about in the offseason, like rule changes? And we've heard rumors that they're going to consider a sky judge for these games. What's on front and center? What's on the front burner for that stuff?
Well, tomorrow we actually complete our committee report. So we have our final competition committee call. It's been interesting. From the booth official, that was a proposal that was submitted by the Baltimore Ravens of a booth judge. We think we're in a good place with replay and the administration of replay. There's been we see Philadelphia submitted the 4th and 15. So we've had some interesting, as we always do, that the committee vets. And this is where I love, Steve, I love the democratic process. And the Bills had a resolution that they proposed about moving the hiring cycle towards to after Super Bowl play or after the championship run. So there's different opinions of why we should, why we shouldn't. I just find it interesting. The one thing that I'm proud of each of the proposals that have come in, both from the club and from the committee, is the possible elimination of the cut block. And that's something that our medical staff, Dr. York and his committee and the BioCore team, trying to reduce unnecessary risk. That mobile block, that blocking in space creates the unnecessary risk that we don't want, one, from a head and neck injury standpoint and lower extremity injuries. So seeing that as a former player and being able to appreciate taking things out of game that just people, it's just not good for the game to see that proposal being submitted by our coaches subcommittee and the competition committee and the efforts that we've made eliminating the blind side block. We look at kickoff return, the better helmets, the elimination of the cut block in the box, which we'll see and we'll discuss. That tackle to tackle box, eliminating that, and then out in space, so you can still cut inside of that tackle box, but in space, eliminating that. That's good for the bigs as well as the guys on the back end.
Talking to NFL Executive Vice President of Football Operations, Troy Vincent. And Troy, I know you've kind of been front and center in playing a role with the diversity and inclusion initiatives in the league. And we saw at least some measure of traction at the GM level. Martin Mayhew, Brad Holmes, Terry Fontenot. We've seen some measure of traction with respect to women in the game, coaches being hired, officials now on staffs across the league, officiating games. Got a couple of women now in the fold. So what about the coaching ranks, though? That, I think, is where a lot of people feel, the hirings kind of came up short. David Culley, obviously, was a new add as a person of color. But where do you guys kind of forge the path forward, and do you have to change it in terms of the means and the initiatives you're trying to undertake here to foster a greater degree of change than we're seeing right now at the coaching level?
Because I would say daily conversation, and you nailed it, there was progress. And when you look at the totality, we didn't end up where we thought we would from a head coaching standpoint, but we do celebrate. And I think it's important that we acknowledge those who were able to obtain those leadership roles. You mentioned the 3 GMs. You look at Anthony Lynn. You look at where we ended up with some of the D'Amico Ryan. We made progress in a lot of different areas. So today we examined from the policies, from our identification of talent, the gender side. I mean, I'm still having a hard time putting my arms around why are we still having this discussion around inclusion and gender. Like, we're almost we just began 2021, and we still are talking about inequalities for women. Like, that blows my mind. This is where we as men, there are more men that believe in inclusion and inequality than those who don't. We just got to keep forging forward. So, hey, we'll re-examine under Deja Smith and Sherman Rooney's leadership. We're examining the policies. Anything need to be tweaked in the Rooney Rule? Anything needs to be tweaked in our anti-tampering policy? We'll look at the resolution that was submitted by Buffalo. It's a daily talk, it's a daily discussion. We think we're in a good spot based off of some of the things that were implemented a year ago. Again, didn't make the progress we did on the head coaching side, but we made a lot of progress in the hiring totality. But we got some work to do.
So, and we just heard this offseason that Maya Chaka becomes the first. She's going to be she's going to be a white hat, correct?
Yes. So she's a line judge. So it's, once again, we talk about historical moments. Come on, we need to normalize these things. I mean, Sarah Thomas had a wonderful season. She was the first female official. We got Maya, the first African-American. We got to normalize these things, which starts with presenting opportunities for both women and people of color. So again, we got to I'm gonna put the onus on the men that lead these organizations, that run these organizations. We got to get current. We got to become current in our thinking from trainers. We should be instituting women and talent across, forget color, but we should be looking for the best. But I'm happy about Maya Shaka. I mean, think about this. 101 years of football, Chris. We had our first black crew, week 11. Had another week 17 that most didn't notice. We got to normalize those things. We shouldn't be talking about that. Not in 2021. So it just shows you, hey, the National Football League, like other organizations, we got work to do. But if we want to be the premium sport and what we call the true melting pot of America, we look at our fan base. We could represent excellence. We could do that. We could be a model. We could be a living example of what it can be. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm hopeful. I'm happy that leadership is aiming in that direction. And I'm looking forward to this offseason.
And I know I don't have to tell you or Steve this, but sports in general, is probably ahead of the curve in most cases in terms of multicultural integration, because the locker room can be made up of just about anybody. But I kind of go back. It's almost a year ago now. It's crazy to think about this, but on the heels of the George Floyd incident, I know that our organization had Leslie Frazier get together with everybody on a Zoom call and kind of lead a Zoom call. And I know you know Leslie well because he was your DB's coach with the Eagles. But I got to tell you, Troy, it was one of the most eye-opening Zoom calls that I have ever been a part of. And I know Zoom was very young at that time. But, like, we were sitting down, and I think I consider myself a pretty well-rounded and cultured person in terms of respecting other people's cultures and backgrounds. But just the emotion that he brought to it was just so eye-opening, even for me, a person that grew up in the greater New York City area who was exposed to a wide variety of backgrounds just because New York is such a melting pot. The knowledge base that someone like Leslie Frazier can come from, I just think is such a valuable tool for this league to utilize going forward.
Yes. And Chris, we live that out our sport. I mean, think about this, Taz. The one thing we know, we're in the locker room, game day. The last thing we think about is color. Hey, when you were in that huddle, it was about Jim, Thurman, Andre. I mean, you would just think about, let's just make the play. Care who got the ball or what color he or she was. But the organization, all of our organizations, you mentioned Leslie, each of our organizations are made up of great men and women. Sometimes we're not willing to listen and hear. We're at that place now. I think our society in 2020, there was a true turning and a true awakening for all. So each of our organizations have great people like Leslie, great players. We just have to be willing to listen and hear, because we do have differences, which are good, but we got to have civil conversation so that we can move forward.
Troy, last thing I got to ask you is about the coming season. You had a lot of work to do with yourselves, DeMaurice Smith, J.C. Treader, the union, and the league really had to work together this last season to get a lot of things done. Is there any issues that you guys still have to iron out? You don't have to give us details, but are there big issues that are – I mean, you just signed a deal, but you had to almost renegotiate it immediately to get the season going. What other issues are – first of all, from the league's perspective, what issues do you want to talk to the union about going forward, and what do they want to talk to you about going forward? What's the next thing on the labor relations front?
I don't think there's any issue, Steve, here. I think we showed last year, and I think, say, the year before last, you put a 10-year labor agreement in place. You put 256 games in 17 weeks. You had a successful Super Bowl. I think it showed all of us the power of collaboration and teamwork. We got through 256 games. If we can get through that, come on. Phase 1, phase 2 of an off season. You just signed a media deal, which is good for the game, for everyone. The fan doesn't want to hear anybody talk about millionaires and billionaires talking about paragraph 5 and who's making what. They want to see games. They want to start building their fantasy football team. I do, but there's no pending issues. Nothing that we can't resolve, or leadership. And I think this is what D and Commissioner Goodell has done. They forged, there's nothing like labor peace. And when you have labor peace, the pandemic is a great example. If you can get through that, there's nothing we can't discuss or we can't resolve. The fans want to see games. The players want to play. And club principal owners want to see the fandom that exists in the 32 cities.
Troy, real quick before we let you go, just getting back to our initial thing that we brought up, the NFL draft being in Cleveland. I saw NFL Network's Judy Battista did tweet out that we don't know yet in terms of how many fans will be allowed to congregate there and enjoy the draft over the 2 or 3 days. I'm guessing you guys are kind of at the mercy of what the municipal protocols are at that time come late April, so you're kind of in a holding pattern. Is that right?
Yes, and it's always been that way. Always go through CDC guidelines, state and local regulations, and then we go back to Dr. Sills and his team, and we adjust from there.
All right, very good.
Thanks, Troy.
Always a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for giving us some time today. We appreciate it.
Appreciate you, man.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate you both.